Views. France 24 brings you all the news from hotspots around the world. In France, Asia, the Middle East, the Americas, and Africa. From Europe to Oceania, take a daily trip across borders to keep abreast of all the latest international news. Get exclusive updates from our correspondents around the globe. Our daily reports will take you to all four corners of the world. Every day, watch World Views on France 24 and France24.com.
An outpouring of grief in Jerusalem as a TV journalist shot and killed in the West Bank is laid to rest. She was covering a raid when witnesses say she was killed by Israeli police. A Russian soldier goes on trial in Ukraine for the killing of an unarmed civilian. It's the first time a member of the Russian military is being prosecuted for an alleged war crime since the conflict began. In Iran, police have arrested at least 22 people who are protesting soaring food prices. The arrests follow an announcement this week that the cost of some items would rise by as much as 300%. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. A TV journalist who was killed in the occupied West Bank is being laid to rest today. Shireen Abu Akleh worked for Al Jazeera's Arabic channel and was a very familiar face to viewers. Witnesses say she was shot and killed by Israeli police while covering a raid and that she was wearing a vest that identified her as a member of the press. Israel said it's investigating her death, while the Palestinian Authority says it's taking the case to the International Criminal Court. Funeral service was held in Jerusalem's Old City this afternoon. And joining us now is our international affairs editor, Armin Georgian. Armin, so before all this happened, tensions were already pretty high. Can you set the scene for us? What was the source of those tensions?
Well, the pictures from the funeral are very striking. I mean, it's clearly a very tense atmosphere. There have been some clashes with involving Israeli police even at the funeral, and all of this speaks to just what a symbol Shireen Abu Akleh actually is for a lot of Palestinians in the West Bank, because she's was really well known as somebody who went into people's homes to find stories. She talked to so many people in a career that began in the late 1990s, so she was really very familiar. And that's why, in a sense, that the crowds at this funeral reflect that she was more than simply a journalist, but actually a very well-known face on their television screens. But also, you know, the very charged atmosphere that we've seen from pictures from the funeral shows that for the Palestinians, her death fits into a pattern of, as far as they see it, wanton Israeli atrocities committed against Palestinians with relative impunity. Obviously, Israel disputes that and says that it investigates any allegations of abuse. But if you take, for example, the newspaper Haaretz, which in October 2020 brought a whole list of as yet unresolved cases to the IDF spokesperson's unit, and found that most of them were actually there was no conclusion, and a lot of them had not reached the end of any investigation. So there is at least the perception on the Palestinian side is that the Israelis often don't go as far as they could with these investigations, that inquests don't always reach a conclusion. And certainly in this very charged political atmosphere today, we can see that there is absolutely no prospect of a joint investigation with, you know, cooperation between forensics, police, medical services on both sides of this huge, you know, political chasm between Israelis and Palestinians, and therefore each side, quote unquote, will obviously continue with their own narratives. So Israel now coming out with its own probe saying, well, we can't determine for sure where the gunfire was coming from. It could have been from Palestinian gunmen. It could have been from an Israeli soldier, but only in response to a terrorist firing on the Israeli soldier's vehicle. That won't have surprised anybody on the Palestinian side. The Palestinian probe, meanwhile, wants to work with the International Criminal Court. Israel will say that's proof that the Palestinians have a political conclusion that they want to reach, not an independent legal process. That, of course, is exactly the mirror of the accusation that is made by Palestinians against Israeli inquiries into such things. So all of this goes back to this very, very deep divide, Monty.
Well, it sounds like the bottom line is it may be very difficult to get to the bottom of exactly what happened because of those dueling investigations. Okay, Armin Georgian, our international affairs editor, thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Well, a Russian soldier went on trial in Ukraine today for the killing of an unarmed civilian. It's the first time a member of the Russian military is being prosecuted for an alleged war crime since the conflict began. If convicted, the 21-year-old faces life in prison. Our regional correspondent Gulliver Craig has more.
It was just the first hearing that took place in the courtroom behind me, which is an ordinary criminal court. It's not a special war crimes tribunal or a military tribunal or anything. It's a standard criminal court. The courtroom, which was very small, was absolutely packed with media. Also, the accused was there in the dock in a cage, as is standard procedure in Ukrainian courtrooms. He didn't really give away any emotion. He's a very young man. He's 21 years old. Vadim Shisimarin is his name, and he's accused of killing a civilian in northern Ukraine as Russian forces were trying to escape Ukrainian forces, as basically the Russians were executing a very chaotic retreat from that region at the time. And the prosecutors who were here said that although there are only 2 other Russian soldiers who are currently in the dock in Ukrainian custody, there are already dozens of trials that were ready to go ahead in absentia if the Ukrainian prosecutors decided that that was the best way to go. Russia, of course, being unlikely to extradite any of its soldiers that are accused of such crimes. And then thousands more. This is, I believe, the biggest war crimes investigation in world history, if one takes the whole of Ukraine, of all the different investigations that are being carried out by different departments in Ukraine at the moment. I was actually in Irpin this morning, the Kiev suburb that saw really fierce fighting between Ukrainian and Russian forces and war crimes committed. When you go there, you can always see teams of people investigating one way or another. And a policeman I spoke to there said that it's not just the police, there are also prosecutors, there are also various international bodies who are involved. It's a huge, very large-scale operation. But one thing that's difficult, of course, is finding witnesses to the killings that took place in places like Irpin and Bucha when artillery battles were also raging. Because while in this village in northern Ukraine where Vadim Shisimarin is accused of having killed this civilian, there were witnesses. Numerous people saw what happened. In Irpin and Bucha, most people were hiding in their basements to shelter from the artillery fire.
That's our regional correspondent Gulliver Craig reporting. Well, some 6 million people have fled Ukraine since the war began. Many have made it to neighboring countries such as Poland, Romania, and Moldova. The United Nations says that about 8 million people have been displaced inside Ukraine. Becca Hell has this update.
According to the UN Refugee Agency on Thursday, more than 6 million people have fled Ukraine since February 24th, with women and children making up 90% of the figures. Here in neighbouring Poland, more than 3 million refugees have been welcomed since the war began, the highest number in Europe.
I was lucky that I've managed to get out because life was really hard there. I don't know how to find a job or friends. This is my situation now.
Many also use this as a pit stop before continuing their journey onwards.
My family had already left for Germany. Now I will join my daughters and granddaughters there. They evacuated even earlier, as soon as the shelling began. I sat and looked after the house, but I didn't manage to defend it.
In Lyon, Alina has just received her residence permit after living in a refugee centre for months.
They provided all sorts of help and support. I'm very grateful. I'd love to live among these people.
even as they allowed me to live here for 6 months. I'm very grateful to France and all the people who helped us.
This centre used to welcome hundreds every day, but the figures have steadily dropped. The UN says that 3.4 million Ukrainians fled the country in March, but in April the numbers fell to 1.5 million. The population of this tiny Spanish village has increased 3% since welcoming several refugees. Houses have been found for them and translators allocated.
I just want my children safe and my family reunited. Where we're all going to live, I don't know yet.
According to UN estimates, more than 8 million people could flee Ukraine over this year.
In Iran, police have arrested at least 22 people who were protesting soaring food prices in at least 2 southern cities. The arrests follow an announcement this week that the cost of cooking oil, chicken, eggs, and milk would rise by as much as 300%. Several factors appear to be in play, including rising inflation, the war in Ukraine, a drought, and Western sanctions. Our correspondent in Tehran, Reza Saya, told us more about the protests.
When you have protests like this in Iran, it's oftentimes very difficult, sometimes impossible to verify exactly how big they are, how widespread they are, and exactly where they are, especially when they're outside of Tehran, because we simply don't have access to these locations and we can't independently verify what's happening. However, with the limited information we have, let's tell you what we do know. Over the past 24 hours, we've seen an increasing number of video clips posted online, posted on social media, showing demonstrations and protests in at least 2 southern cities in the southern province of Khuzestan. In these protests, you see demonstrators sometimes chanting anti-government slogans against current Iranian President Ebrahim Raisi. Sometimes the protests are turning violent. When you look at these video clips, you see rioters burning tires and security forces responding by firing tear gas in an effort to disperse the demonstrators. Very limited reporting by Iran's state media. One of the few reports we saw earlier today said that 22 demonstrators have been arrested. Why are people angry? Because of sudden price hikes when it comes to basic food items. The government announcing price hikes with 4 basic food items, including cooking oil, eggs, chicken, and milk. Other food items, including sandwich bread, pasta, flour, they've gone up as well. And the reason for these sudden price hikes are twofold. On one hand, these price hikes are part of Iran's efforts to reform the economy, to get rid of very costly subsidies. The other reason is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Both Russia and Ukraine, major suppliers of food to Iran. Russia supplies at least half of Iran's wheat supply. Ukraine supplying Iran with a lot of cooking oil. Obviously, the conflict there disrupting some of those supplies, and that too has led to some of these sudden price hikes.
That's our correspondent in Tehran, Reza Saya, reporting. Sri Lanka's new prime minister is struggling to form a unified government. Ranil Wickremesinghe was sworn in on Thursday. The country faces an imminent economic collapse. Opposition lawmakers are refusing to join his cabinet and are demanding fresh elections. North Korea has confirmed its first COVID-19 death. The secretive government said tens of thousands of people were being isolated after falling sick. The country's 25 million people are said to be unvaccinated against COVID. The insular country only reported its first COVID cases on Thursday. At an auction for more than $12 million. The skeleton is from the beast that inspired the velociraptor in the film Jurassic Park. The bones are believed to be the first of their kind sold at public auction. The buyer has not been identified. Okay, that's it for now. Stay tuned for more world news coming up here on France 24.
Welcome to Across Africa, our weekly look at stories from across the continent. I'm Georgia Calvin-Smith, and this week, world leaders and hundreds of delegates headed to Ivory Coast for COP15 to discuss ways to tackle aspects of the climate emergency that affect deforestation and desertification. More than a quarter of the world's fertile land can no longer be cultivated. Also, France spent centuries trafficking in Africans. Slavery was banned for good in 1848, but its legacy continues to impact on the sense of identity of many people from the French Caribbean. Some have been heading to Africa to reconnect with parts of a long-lost culture. And homeless children are getting their groove on in Chad's capital. A professional dancer runs a centre there where dozens of abandoned kids are fed, housed, and taught how to put their best foot forward. But first, at the opening of the COP15 Biodiversity Summit in Ivory Coast, President Alassane Ouattara warned that his country's forests could be gone by 2050. He's trying to raise $1.5 billion for a restoration project that could help reverse damage that's seen around 90% of Ivory Coast's forests disappear over the last 60 years. Our correspondent travelled to the east of the country where villagers are trying to combat illegal cocoa farming.
In this classified forest in eastern Ivory Coast, self-appointed guardians use a standard method to deter illegal cocoa farmers, warning shots. These men are active members of the Save the Bossé-Mathieu Forest organization who routinely patrol the woods with firearms.
We come out in significant numbers for security reasons, because we never know if they have weapons or not.
No sign of illegal cocoa farmers here, except for the damage they have left behind. An area where the trees have all been cleared. Illegal farmers destroy them one after the other by burning their trunk.
Since they can't destroy trees with a chainsaw, they just set them on fire.
In the last 10 years, 55% of this forest has been ravaged. With a quick look, you can easily spot each hole, which is a sign of an illegal cocoa plantation. Residents from the surrounding villages who make up Save the Bossé-Mathieu Forest created this organization because they felt sidelined by the government.
Not one, not a single political figure has bothered to call us and check in, despite all our efforts.
For the past 5 years, the government has announced a plethora of measures to combat deforestation. According to this cocoa farming expert, those measures are far from enough. He estimates that 40% of the national cocoa production stems from classified forests. He's calling for a change of strategy to prevent further irreparable damage.
The government has proven its inability to protect forests. So it has to involve the people and work with local residents who are willing to take part in that fight.
As the COP15 on desertification just began in Ivory Coast, the Bossé-Mathieu forest activists are hoping that their message will finally be heard.
The war in Ukraine's seen food prices rise in Nigeria. Russia is its third largest supplier, but the conflict in Eastern Europe has disrupted supplies and sent the price of flour shooting up. Chinwe Osondu reports.
Like hundreds of thousands of wholesalers in Lagos, this shop's turnover is in free fall. Already on the rise since 2021, prices of wheat products have soared further since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Alaja Fatima has been in the grain wholesale business for almost 30 years. She still manages to get supplies despite fewer customers by the day.
We pay for 100 bags of wheat and flour what we used to pay for 300, and our customers can't afford to buy as much as they used to.
The same is true of this bakery. Here, the owner is already wondering about the survival of his business, which opened only a year ago. With the collapse of sales, Olabode is not sure he will be able to keep his business or his 5 employees for much longer. To manage production costs, he's reduced the size of his loaves.
One of the things we just do is that, okay, we tactically reduce the dough, but unfortunately that is not sustainable. It's not sustainable in the fact that the sizes of our pan that is taking that dough, you can't continue reducing it because it's going to have an impact on the production. So we had to take that decision, that decision at a point in time to notify people that we're going to increase it to 15 naira.
Nigeria consumes on the average between 5 to 6 million tons of wheat per year. Its domestic production is barely 63,000 tons. This cereal and its derivatives form the daily menu of 100 million people. This restaurant owner has adjusted her prices to the inflation of wheat cost.
With everything being so expensive now, everyone is complaining. But most people do not have any other option but to buy it at that price. When they give you a price at the market, you can only scream and complain, but you have to buy. We cannot eat our money. We must buy irrespective of the price.
Shortages could potentially threaten social stability with general elections less than a year away.
Well, slavery was active in the French colonies since the early 16th century, and by 1778, about 13,000 African people were being trafficked as slaves to the French West Indies every year. Today, some people from French Caribbean communities are curious about their historical African identity. Some have been heading towards West Africa, where many of their ancestors were first enslaved, and they're hoping to reconnect with lost traditions there. Our correspondent sent us this report.
Bako is originally from Guadeloupe. The 30-year-old left everything to settle in Benin 3 years ago, several centuries after one of his ancestors was taken from Africa during the slave trade. François Gabour comes from Martinique. For his comic book project, the author spent a few weeks in Benin researching on the African heritage of the West Indies. Stefan chose a West African name, Bako, long before his arrival on the continent. Since then, he's continued his apprenticeship in Benin, off the beaten track and far from the usual tourism sites. He centered his studies at this primary school, where both the official curriculum and indigenous culture is taught. Here, students learn about topics like the virtues of plants and the divinatory art called the fa. For Bako, the healing of his identity requires, above all, reconnection with his voodoo heritage.
Je le vois aujourd'hui beaucoup plus comme une science et un mode de vie qui est totalement partie prenante de la culture. C'est en ce sens-là que pour moi c'était important. Mon objet était de renouer avec les origines de ma culture, de pouvoir renouer aussi avec cette partie spirituelle.
L'école du vaudou, c'est tellement inimaginable en Martinique et en Guadeloupe.
The Supreme Pontiff Voodoo Huendo, Dagbo Unon II, comes to meet some of the Afro-descendants.
Nous devons tout faire pour que ceux-là qui sont partis involontairement et par force puissent retrouver leur véritable source.
François was invited 2 days later to a traditional clairvoyant consultation. He chooses not to participate. Stefan was previously initiated into Haitian voodoo and so is more comfortable learning more about this aspect of West African spiritual tradition.
La première des réparations serait finalement celle-là, de pouvoir reprendre le fil là où il a été coupé, de pouvoir reprendre ce dont on nous a dépossédé en réalité en déportant nos aïeux dans les Caraïbes.
The voodoo practitioners have never forgotten these Africans that were transported to the West Indies and the Americas. Every year since 1728, on the 10th of January, they have performed rituals to celebrate uprooted ancestors and call their descendants back. Today, about 50 Afro-Caribbeans have made their way back to Benin to remain indefinitely.
Niger has the highest population growth rate in the world. That puts its education system under a lot of pressure. Many children drop out of school and some start working to help their families. The government's tried to tackle the issue of child labour with limited success. Our team reports.
This young boy with a red hat sells small bags of drinking water for a living. He starts work every day at 8 a.m. He claims to be 16 years old, but he looks no more than 13.
Usually I take a break to eat, and I get back to work at 2 p.m. At the end of the day, I only head back home after the first prayer of the evening at around 8 p.m. When I sell a lot, the woman who employs me pays me 8 euros per month. Most of the time, it's around 5 euros.
Dropping out of school put him in this situation, but he says it could be worse. A lot of early school dropouts do not have a second chance. In Niger, 57% of boys aged 15 to 24 are neither at school nor working. Niger's successive governments have tried to address the issue of education, but there's still a long way to go.
Some students don't even have the money to take the bus to get here. This is what forces some classmates to skip class, to work instead and make some money.
Psychology research professor Fatima Mayaki believes that students are influencing the rest of the population towards better education for the youth.
When there are more students, there's more open-mindedness. There's a lot more attraction towards different fields of studies and science. It can inspire young people who have stayed in their villages and hopefully make the government invest more in higher education.
University remains a fortunate aspiration for many young Africans. In sub-Saharan Africa in 2022, at least 104 million people had dropped out of school before turning 18.
Well, in Chad's capital, N'Djamena, thousands of children live on the streets. One professional dancer has turned his passion into a way to offer abandoned and homeless kids a chance at stability and self-expression. He's opened a centre where they're fed, given a home, and classes in contemporary and traditional African dance. Laurent Berstecker tells us more.
Turning up the music and busting out the moves. These children all used to live on the streets of the Chadian capital before Aleva Ndavogo Jude offered them a chance at a new life.
When we dance, we forget all our worries. We only think of moving together.
We make them dance to gain their trust, so that these children feel like they can tell us everything, tell us why they're on the streets.
Over 3,000 abandoned or orphaned children roam the streets of N'Djamena and are left to fend for themselves. A professional dancer, Jude created a collective to identify them and help them get back on their feet.
How long have you been on the streets?
Since I was 10 years old, so it's been 2 years now. I beg and try to get leftovers from restaurants.
Jude recently opened a shelter where 60 youngsters aged 6 to 20 are fed and housed for up to a year. Every day he teaches them fresh dance moves, but also regular subjects like maths and geography to help them become independent. Abdel Mousse's parents were killed by Boko Haram 3 years ago. Thanks to his time at the shelter, he's now a full-fledged dressmaker.
I have my machine, I have my own room, I'm already a man.
The program has already helped some 600 children become financially independent. For most of them, it all started with a dance.
Well, that's it for Across Africa for now. Thanks for joining us, and do so again if you can. Till then, take care.
This year, France is celebrating Portuguese culture with concerts, exhibitions and performances from the country's top artists.
Hello, France 24. This is Dino de Santiago and Marfox in Quinta do Mocho.
France 24 Culture Show has decided to take you on a musical voyage to Lisbon, where African rhythms are breaking down social barriers and helping a country face up to its colonial past. Join us as we explore one of Europe's richest cultural landscapes.
Encore, presented by Eve Jackson on France 24 and France24.com.
the news. A daily opportunity to go beyond the headlines and explore the news in depth. Revisited, a return to places which were in the news a long time ago. Reporters, our in-depth reports on international news. The 51%, a program about women reshaping our world. The Observers, meet our observers who alert us to hidden realities. Focus, exclusive reports by our correspondents and journalists. And Down to Earth, on the vast potential of our planet. Every day, watch Beyond the News on France 24 and France24.com.
An outpouring of grief in Jerusalem as a TV journalist shot and killed in the West Bank is laid to rest. She was covering a raid when witnesses say she was killed by Israeli police. A Russian soldier goes on trial in Ukraine for the killing of an unarmed civilian. It's the first time a member of the Russian military is being prosecuted for an alleged war crime since the conflict began. In Iran, police have arrested at least 22 people who were protesting soaring food prices. The arrests follow an announcement this week that the cost of some items would rise by as much as 300%. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. A TV journalist who was killed in the occupied West Bank is being laid to rest today. Shireen Abu Akleh worked for Al Jazeera's Arabic channel and was a very familiar face to viewers. Witnesses say she was shot and killed by Israeli police while covering a raid and that she was wearing a vest that identified her as a member of the press. Israel said it's investigating her death, while the Palestinian Authority says it's taking the case to the International Criminal Court. Funeral service was held in Jerusalem's Old City this afternoon. And joining us now is our international affairs editor, Armin Georgian. Armin, so before all this happened, tensions were already pretty high. Can you set the scene for us? What was the source of those tensions?
Well, the pictures from the funeral are very striking. I mean, it's clearly a very tense atmosphere. There have been some clashes with involving Israeli police even at the funeral, and all of this speaks to just what a symbol Shireen Abu Akleh actually is for a lot of Palestinians in the West Bank, because she's was really well known as somebody who went into people's homes to find stories. She talked to so many people in a career that began in the late 1990s, so she was really very familiar. And that's why, in a sense, that the crowds at this funeral reflect that she was more than simply a journalist, but actually a very well-known face on their television screens. But also, you know, the very charged atmosphere that we've seen from pictures from the funeral shows that for the Palestinians, her death fits into a pattern of, as far as they see it, wanton Israeli atrocities committed against Palestinians with relative impunity. Obviously, Israel disputes that and says that it investigates any allegations of abuse. But if you take, for example, the newspaper Haaretz, which in October 2020 brought a whole list of as yet unresolved cases to the IDF spokesperson's unit, and found that most of them were actually there was no conclusion, and a lot of them had not reached the end of any investigation. So there is at least the perception on the Palestinian side is that the Israelis often don't go as far as they could with these investigations, that inquests don't always reach a conclusion. And certainly in this very charged political atmosphere today, we can see that there is absolutely no prospect of a joint investigation with, you know, cooperation between forensics, police, medical services on both sides of this huge, you know, political chasm between Israelis and Palestinians, and therefore each side, quote unquote, will obviously continue with their own narratives. So Israel now coming out with its own probe saying, well, we can't determine for sure where the gunfire was coming from. It could have been from Palestinian gunmen. It could have been from an Israeli soldier, but only in response to a terrorist firing on the Israeli soldier's vehicle. That won't have surprised anybody on the Palestinian side. The Palestinian probe, meanwhile, wants to work with the International Criminal Court. Israel will say that's proof that the Palestinians have a political conclusion that they want to reach, not an independent legal process. That, of course, is exactly the mirror of the accusation that is made by Palestinians against Israeli inquiries into such things. So all of this goes back to this very, very deep divide, Monty.
Well, it sounds like the bottom line is it may be very difficult to get to the bottom of exactly what happened because of those dueling investigations. Okay, Armin Georgian, our international affairs editor, thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Well, a Russian soldier went on trial in Ukraine today for the killing of an unarmed civilian. It's the first time a member of the Russian military is being prosecuted for an alleged war crime since the conflict began. If convicted, the 21-year-old faces life in prison. Our regional correspondent Gulliver Craig has more.
It was just the first hearing that took place in the courtroom behind me, which is an ordinary criminal court. It's not a special war crimes tribunal or a military tribunal or anything. It's a standard criminal court. The courtroom, which was very small, was absolutely packed with media. Also, the accused was there in the dock in a cage, as is standard procedure in Ukrainian courtrooms. He didn't really give away any emotion. He's a very young man. He's 21 years old. Vadim Shishimarin is his name, and he's accused of killing a civilian in northern Ukraine as Russian forces were trying to escape Ukrainian forces, as basically the Russians were executing a very chaotic retreat from that region at the time. And the prosecutors who were here said that although there are only 2 other Russian soldiers who are currently in the dock in Ukrainian custody, there are already dozens of trials that were ready to go ahead in absentia if the Ukrainian prosecutors decided that that was the best way to go. Russia, of course, being unlikely to extradite any of its soldiers that are accused of such crimes. And then thousands more. This is, I believe, the biggest war crimes investigation in world history, if one takes the whole of Ukraine, of all the different investigations that are being carried out by different departments in Ukraine at the moment. I was actually in Irpin this morning, the Kiev suburb that saw really fierce fighting between Ukrainian and Russian forces and war crimes committed. When you go there, you can always see teams of people investigating one way or another. And a policeman I spoke to there said that it's not just the police, there are also prosecutors, there are also various international bodies who are involved. It's a huge, very large-scale operation. But one thing that's difficult, of course, is finding witnesses to the killings that took place in places like Irpin and Bucha when artillery battles were also raging. Because while in this village in northern Ukraine where Vadim Shishimarin is accused of having killed this civilian, there were witnesses. Numerous people saw what happened. In Irpin and Bucha, most people were hiding in their basements to shelter from the artillery fire.
That's our regional correspondent Gulliver Craig reporting. Well, some 6 million people have fled Ukraine since the war began. Many have made it to neighboring countries such as Poland, Romania, and Moldova. The United Nations says that about 8 million people have been displaced inside Ukraine. Becca Hell has this update.
According to the UN Refugee Agency on Thursday, more than 6 million people have fled Ukraine since February 24th, with women and children making up 90% of the figures. Here in neighbouring Poland, more than 3 million refugees have been welcomed since the war began, the highest number in Europe.
I was lucky that I've managed to get out because life was really hard there. I don't know how to find a job or friends. This is my situation now.
Many also use this as a pit stop before continuing their journey onwards.
My family had already left for Germany. Now I will join my daughters and granddaughters there. They evacuated even earlier, as soon as the shelling began. I sat and looked after the house, but I didn't manage to defend it.
In Lyon, Alina has just received her residence permit after living in a refugee centre for months.
They provided all sorts of help and support. I'm very grateful. I'd love to live among these people. even as they allowed me to live here for 6 months. I'm very grateful to France and all the people who helped us.
This centre used to welcome hundreds every day, but the figures have steadily dropped. The UN says that 3.4 million Ukrainians fled the country in March, but in April the numbers fell to 1.5 million. The population of this tiny Spanish village has increased 3% since welcoming several refugees. Houses have been found for them and translators allocated.
I just want my children safe and my family reunited. Where we're all going to live, I don't know yet.
According to UN estimates, more than 8 million people could flee Ukraine over this year.
In Iran, police have arrested at least 22 people who were protesting soaring food prices in at least 2 southern cities. The arrests follow an announcement this week that the cost of cooking oil, chicken, eggs, and milk would rise by as much as 300%. Several factors appear to be in play, including rising inflation, the war in Ukraine, a drought, and Western sanctions. Our correspondent in Tehran, Reza Saya, told us more about the protests.
When you have protests like this in Iran, it's oftentimes very difficult, sometimes impossible to verify exactly how big they are, how widespread they are, and exactly where they are, especially when they're outside of Tehran, because we simply don't have access to these locations and we can't independently verify what's happening. However, with the limited information we have, let's tell you what we do know. Over the past 24 hours, we've seen an increasing number of video clips posted online, posted on social media, showing demonstrations and protests in at least 2 southern cities in the southern province of Khuzestan. In these protests, you see demonstrators sometimes chanting anti-government slogans against current Iranian President Ebrahim Raisi. Sometimes the protests are turning violent. When you look at these video clips, you see rioters burning tires and security forces responding by firing tear gas in an effort to disperse the demonstrators. Very limited reporting by Iran state media. One of the few reports we saw earlier today said that 22 demonstrators have been arrested. Why are people angry? Because of sudden price hikes when it comes to basic food items. The government announcing price hikes with 4 basic food items, including cooking oil, eggs, chicken, and milk. Other food items, including sandwich bread, pasta, flour, they've gone up as well. And the reason for these sudden price hikes are twofold. On one hand, these price hikes are part of Iran's efforts to reform the economy, to get rid of very costly subsidies. The other reason is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Both Russia and Ukraine, major suppliers of food to Iran. Russia supplies at least half of Iran's wheat supply. Ukraine supplying Iran with a lot of cooking oil. Obviously, the conflict there disrupting some of those supplies, and that too has led to some of these sudden price hikes.
That's our correspondent in Tehran, Reza Saya, reporting. Sri Lanka's new prime minister is struggling to form a unified government. Ranil Wickremesinghe was sworn in on Thursday. The country faces an imminent economic collapse. Opposition lawmakers are refusing to join his cabinet and are demanding fresh elections. North Korea has confirmed its first COVID-19 death. The secretive government said tens of thousands of people were being isolated after falling sick. The country's 25 million people are said to be unvaccinated against COVID. The insular country only reported its first COVID cases on Thursday. Leo McGuinn with the story.
Kim Jong-un visiting North Korea's National Epidemic Prevention Headquarters. Earlier on Thursday, according to state media, the country's leader had met with Worker Party members to discuss the COVID outbreak in the country. His response, to declare a gravest state of emergency and to announce a national lockdown. State media have said that 6 people have died and thousands have fell ill of fever, but they have acknowledged that one of the 6 to die was infected with the Omicron variant. According to the official news agency, 350,000 people have been treated for fever since late April. More than 180,000 North Koreans are currently in isolation and undergoing treatment, although it has not been specified how many of them tested positive for COVID-19. The nation's 26 million people are believed to be mostly unvaccinated. North Korea had rejected offers of vaccination from the WHO, but also from China and Russia. Experts say an outbreak could be a catastrophe.
Because of COVID, food shortages and the economic crisis might deteriorate in North Korea. In order to prevent that, North Korea is conducting food rationing measures. So they're under very severe quarantine measures to prevent a mass outbreak of confirmed COVID cases.
According to experts, the virus was imported into North Korea by a person who crossed the border illegally from China.
The remains of a dinosaur have been sold at auction for more than $12 million. The skeleton is from the beast that inspired the velociraptor in the film Jurassic Park. The bones are believed to be the first of their kind sold at a public auction. The buyer has not been identified. That's it for now. Stay tuned for more world news coming up here on France 24.
Along rivers, dams leave an indelible mark. Erected to generate power, the concrete walls have upended ecosystems. Migrating salmon can no longer find their way back to their home streams to spawn. France is now dismantling some of its dams in a last-ditch effort to save the iconic species.
Donc nous sommes sur la rivière Sélune, qui est une rivière qui coule dans la baie du Mont-Saint-Michel en France. On est les docteurs de la rivière, c'est-à-dire qu'on va prendre le pouls, la santé de la rivière. Ici, le projet d'enlèvement des 2 barrages de la Sélune est le plus gros qu'on connaisse en cours en Europe. Le premier a été enlevé à partir de 2019. C'est le barrage de Vezin. Il reste actuellement le 2e barrage, la Roche-Tibois, qui va être retiré cette année. Ces 2 barrages, il a été décidé de les enlever parce que la production d'électricité n'était plus assez importante par rapport aux désagréments que créent les barrages pour l'environnement. Et ce qu'on veut surtout comprendre, c'est qu'est-ce qui va réellement changer entre avant et après les barrages. Nous faisons des comptages régulièrement, annuellement, quotidiennement même, du nombre de poissons qui migrent, qui rentrent dans la rivière et qui quittent la rivière. Donc plusieurs équipes se relaient ici, des équipes qui travaillent en pêche électrique. Sur la Sélune, actuellement, nous avons plusieurs espèces qui sont bloquées à l'aval du dernier barrage. L'anguille européenne, la lamproie marine, certains même sont des grands migrateurs comme le saumon atlantique. On se reproduit en rivière et on va grossir en mer. Si on obstrue le passage entre ces 2 habitats, ces populations sont amenées à disparaître. On passe beaucoup de temps avec les poissons, ces juvéniles de saumon, tout argentés. Et ce temps-là est passé pour nous à ausculter vraiment ce qu'ils sont, les mesurer, pouvoir faire des petits prélèvements pour comprendre quel est leur état de santé à eux aussi. Et ensuite, on va pouvoir utiliser ces données-là au long cours pour bien comprendre la restauration des populations une fois les barrages enlevés. La rivière est tout à fait fonctionnelle et on commence à retrouver un aspect naturel. On est très surpris de voir la vitesse à laquelle ça va. Les premières algues, par exemple, vont se développer très rapidement et donner lieu à l'arrivée aussi d'invertébrés qui vont pouvoir brouter ces algues. Ces petits invertébrés sont eux-mêmes les proies des poissons que nous attendons tous. Donc cette cicatrisation de la rivière et ce renouveau va très vite et c'est une des grandes surprises de ce travail qui est en cours actuellement dans nos équipes. Cette façon qu'a la rivière de reprendre ses droits, c'est véritablement un message important et c'est même un message d'espoir. C'est-à-dire que dans un moment où on pense que beaucoup de choses ne vont plus au niveau de notre environnement, on peut avoir des signes comme ça, assez tangibles, d'un retour de la nature et je trouve que ça, c'est plus que réconfortant.
Since the dawn of time, humans have wanted to tame rivers. In Europe's waterways, every single kilometer there's an obstacle, ranging from small weirs to massive dams several meters tall. Those barriers have massively contributed to the silent decline of freshwater species, dropping by 81% in Europe alone since the 70s, compared to 36% for marine biodiversity. Certainly, dams generate low-carbon electricity. They're France's #1 source of renewable energy, making the country one of the biggest hydropower producers in Europe. But just like nuclear power plants, dams have a limited lifespan. Many are no longer operating, and across Europe, calls are growing for the concrete walls to be torn down. The EU even promising to restore more than 25,000 kilometers of rivers to their natural state by 2030. Some say the dam removal movement has only just begun.
Moi, je suis un écologiste qui s'inquiète beaucoup de la dégradation des rivières. C'est simplement comme citoyen et homme que je me bats pour des rivières vivantes. Le barrage de Chavanon, il a été construit il y a 100 ans. À l'époque, le plus haut barrage de l'Europe, mais jamais il a été terminé. Et depuis donc 100 ans, il est là, il n'a aucune fonction. Il fait que bloquer la rivière, le transport des sédiments et évidemment la migration des poissons. Il y a en Europe à peu près 1 million d'ouvrages, la moitié est sans aucune utilité. Ils sont obsolètes, trop vieux, trop anciens. Donc ces 500 000 obstacles font du mal à nos rivières. Et ça coûte cher ensuite de les enlever. Donc c'est la raison pourquoi beaucoup des obstacles ont juste été laissés à l'abandon. La France est précurseur en matière de restauration des rivières et en particulier avec l'effacement d'ouvrages. Depuis les années 90, plusieurs centaines de barrages de moyenne taille ou de grande taille, dont une quinzaine en France, ont été effacés. Certains barrages, on ne peut pas se débarrasser, sont utilisés des explosifs. Parfois, on fait carrément sauter. Dans d'autres cas, on fait des petites explosions par-ci, par-là. Mais d'autres barrages, par exemple, un grand barrage de 37 mètres, trop dangereux de l'exploser. Alors là, on enlève, on peut dire, mètre par mètre par mètre. Enlever tous les barrages et obstacles en Europe, ça serait mon rêve, le rêve de beaucoup de gens. Il n'y aura jamais un enlèvement de tous les barrages. Mais si on enlève les 10-15% des plus impactants, ça serait déjà un grand pas vers la restauration des rivières. Il faut produire des barrages aujourd'hui qui sont intelligents, à la fois satisfaire les besoins de la nature et ceux de l'homme.
L'Allier, c'est une rivière qui est extrêmement importante pour les saumons. Et le barrage de Poutès, il est situé au cœur des meilleures zones de reproduction du saumon. Ici, on est sur la première source de production d'énergie renouvelable du département de la Haute-Loire. On vient de finir les travaux qui ont permis de transformer complètement le barrage existant. Donc les travaux ont duré 3 ans. Ils ont commencé en 2019, où on est venu enlever les 3 vannes qui étaient posées sur le barrage. On est venu déconstruire toute la partie superstructure du barrage. Donc on est venu grignoter les bétons. Il est beaucoup plus petit. Il fait 7 mètres de haut, alors qu'auparavant on avait un barrage qui faisait presque 20 mètres de haut. Et 2021, on est venu construire tous les nouveaux ouvrages. On est capable sur ce barrage de le mettre complètement en transparence. Donc on ouvre 2 vannes en partie centrale du barrage. Et quand ces 2 vannes sont ouvertes, la rivière retrouve son cours libre. Il n'y a plus du tout de retenue. Et le saumon, il passe librement, comme s'il n'y avait plus du tout de barrage. Donc ici, on cible 2 périodes. Donc la fin du printemps et l'automne. Donc les périodes qui sont clés pour la remontée des saumons. Alors ça représente 3 mois de l'année. Pendant cette période-là, le barrage de Poutès ne produit pas. Sur l'année, on arrive à préserver 85% de la production d'énergie de l'usine de Monistrol d'Allier. Alors on commence déjà à avoir des résultats. On a déjà noté des frayères de saumon qui s'étaient installées au-dessus du barrage, avec des poissons qui sont venus se reproduire l'hiver dernier au-dessus du barrage. Donc les différences sont vraiment rapides et notables sur le site. Le choix qui a été fait, ça a vraiment été de chercher à trouver une solution qui permettait de concilier ces deux enjeux, de production d'énergie et de préservation de l'environnement.
Redesigning these massive structures is only part of the problem solved. It'll take more than that to save Atlantic salmon. And not too far from here, scientists are helping the iconic migratory fish reclaim their natural habitat.
Nous sommes ici au conservatoire du saumon sauvage, où l'on travaille pour la sauvegarde de l'espèce de saumon de l'Allier. C'est un saumon qui parcourt beaucoup de kilomètres en rivière, qui naît dans le Haut-Allier, qui descend la rivière jusqu'à l'estuaire de la Loire et qui va rejoindre le Groenland avant de revenir à son tour, se reproduire jusque chez nous. Ça fait plus de 10 000 kilomètres aller-retour pour faire tout ce périple. La capture de nos saumons se passe à Vichy. On les ramène ici au conservatoire pour les conserver et les faire se reproduire, j'allais dire en se rapprochant le plus possible des conditions naturelles. Les lampes s'allument chez nous au même moment que le soleil se lève en extérieur. La température de l'eau, c'est la même que celle de la rivière juste à côté. On veille à donner aussi à nos saumons une alimentation pour faire, j'allais dire, des marathoniens et pas des poissons qui grossissent trop et qui ont du muscle au contraire. Tout ça fait que nos saumons, quand on les relâche, ils sont plus adaptés que des saumons d'une pisciculture classique qui n'auraient pas les mêmes capacités. Ce qui est fait au barrage de Poutès aujourd'hui, à mon sens, c'est une grande avancée, mais il ne faut pas oublier que ce n'est pas le seul sur l'axe et qu'il en reste encore beaucoup d'autres. On agit le temps que des travaux se fassent sur la rivière. Ça prend du temps, ça prend de l'argent. Donc en attendant que tout ça s'améliore, nous, notre rôle, c'est de soutenir cette espèce pour qu'elle soit encore présente. Alors les chiffres ont montré que 60 à 80% des poissons qui remontaient la rivière venaient du conservatoire. Mais ce qui est compliqué à savoir, c'est si le conservatoire s'arrêtait, qu'est-ce qu'il adviendrait du saumon? On voit qu'une femelle va pondre 10 000 œufs aujourd'hui dans la rivière et sur ces 10 000 œufs, moins de 1 poisson viendra à son tour se reproduire la génération suivante. On le maintient à bout de bras, ce saumon. Notre travail au conservatoire, c'est de soutenir l'espèce pour aujourd'hui ou dans quelques années ne plus avoir à travailler ici sur le saumon.
Tout d'un coup, on a entendu des coups de feu. Tout le monde criait, tout le monde, qu'est-ce qu'il y a? Il y a les militaires blancs là qui tirent sur les rebelles de la guerre là.
On December 1st, 1944, in the military camp of Tioroy on the outskirts of Dakar, a group of Senegalese riflemen were shot dead by their French brothers-in-arms. They had just been repatriated after having fought side by side and were simply asking to be paid. Described first as a mutiny, then as a revolt by the French army, this long-ignored episode is now thought to have been a deliberate massacre. 3 young artists are setting out to explore the memory of the tragedy.
La vérité finira par prévaloir. Et à ce moment-là, la réconciliation sincère et définitive devient possible.
Watch Reporters Plus, Tioroy 44 on France 24 and France24.com.
effects of the conflict. The displacements are very acute today, the way they were 2, 3 or 4 years ago. So nothing has really changed in the general picture of the situation for the people in Syria. The infrastructures have been destroyed. The pandemic had its impact. The Lebanese crisis, tightly linked economically to Syria, made it so that the country is almost in a free fall of the social services. And we're facing today topics, issues, humanitarian issues, which are even more acute than they were during the activity of the military that we experienced at the beginning of the crisis. Are the consequences of the war on the Ukraine, as we can see the tremendous rise of the price of energy and of the food, is it really hitting hard the Syria, which is already weakened? For the time being, I wouldn't say so, because many donors are keeping the right direction and are supporting us on activities in other places in the country, and budgets for this year have already been approved. I rather fear that in the medium and long term we might have financing effects, and also at the same time those financing effects will take place when the crisis of the services, of the public services in Syria, will have grown even more than what we experienced until today. I think we try and we go and have activities, important activities. We need to start also a new phase to re-establish a minimum of the services in water, in health, and other social services, because in the long run, you cannot deal with a country like Syria only in the emergency with the water tracking and other forms of support which are not relevant. You met with Bashar al-Assad. Is he aware of the situation of the country? We may think that 11 years later, he thinks he will remain for quite a long time. Is this changing his perception of the vision in Syria? I had the feeling of a president who is very aware of the international environment and of the troubles and the pressures exerted by those pressures on Syria. I would say he is really grateful for the humanitarian work and crystal clear in his vision that things cannot go on that way. As you have seen, the Syrian president recently stated a pardon. We have to wait and see if this pardon will be implemented and it will be translated in the liberation of people who are detained currently. I have the feeling that this pardon can be regarded also as an answer, indirect answer, to the pressures that countries like Syria is experiencing today in the attention competition on the humanitarian crisis we're facing. So, from your discussion with him, you think there's a better listening and some more flexibility that didn't exist previously. Until now, it was a flat no. We hope so, certainly, that the cooperations we have started already could be widened, especially with populations and regions in Syria where we had no access or not enough access. And this trip was especially important right now in order to, as we can say, widen our operational surface in the north, east, the northwest, in other areas of Syria, but also regarding the population whose whereabouts were lost, for the reunification of the families, all the questions that the Syrian populations is asking the humanitarian operators like the ICRC, and people coming to us ask for some clarification about their family members, and I hope there will be a widened space, as well as I hope that the space will be widened for the humanitarian assistance, which is so important today. You visited a camp called Al-Hol, located in the northeast of Syria, under control of the Kurd forces, with more than 56,000 people, two-thirds made of women and children, families linked closer or not to ISIS, but also Western families. It's your third visit there. What is the situation in this Al-Hol camp? I'd say three things. On the one hand, I've been impressed by the work of some humanitarian agencies, including ICRC, to improve the situation in the camp. It is remarkable, given the situation and the difficult environment. Number two, I regret to say that in spite of all those efforts, enough isn't done to have an environment that would be acceptable for the population which are there. It's totally unacceptable that children and tens of thousands of children would experience this toughness of a camp right in the middle of the desert, and who, I mean, it's an environment which is so unfavorable to the development of children. It is unacceptable for a situation. And thirdly, I think, as I have said in other occasions, it is deplorable that the international community, in spite of all the efforts, is not doing enough to deliver a minimum of rule of law, of transparency about the status of those women and those children, not enough efforts to really encourage the returns from the camp, or to come up to conduct legal processes with those who perpetrated crimes, or to liberate those who are detained for 3 years without trial and without any legal proceedings, which are absolutely necessary. France is one of the countries which is repatriating the less people from Al-Hol. I will not list now those who are not good at repatriation. What I say is I'm deploring that in spite of the efforts, there are still 56,000 people who are still there, 70% children, women, who are without any legal proceedings, who are in difficult situations, and without a real international effort in order to support the Kurd authorities, but also and mainly to support the returns. Let's get quickly to the situation in the Ukraine. You've been to Moscow, you meet the officials, including Sergei Lavrov, the Minister of Foreign Affairs. All the efforts to create what we call humanitarian corridors are extremely difficult to implement. We're talking a lot about Mariupol, the Azovstal concern. Are you still concerned about the problems to implement humanitarian right in the Ukraine? Well, first I'd like to point at the fact that I went first to Kiev and then I went to Moscow. That's more than 6 weeks ago. Currently, I'd say two things. On the one hand, I'm slightly more optimistic because we succeeded during the past 6 weeks to accomplish and to widen our important operation in the Ukraine to meet the needs of the population by increasing our services to the displaced population for those who are impacted by the war, like the protected population, including the detained, the dead, And we are in a situation which is much better today. On the other hand, it is clear, and we see it every single day through what you are reporting, the situation in an active conflict remains extremely difficult, and there is an important number of population that we are at pain to reach, who have a problem to leave, to get out. The negotiations are complex because the reality on the ground is complex. You need an agreement of the military forces on both sides to have a mutual trust, to have evacuation and safe accesses. You have seen that we succeeded in some places, Mariupol, Sumy and others, to accede to populations which are difficult to accede to. So we succeed in doing some things, but not enough, because trust between the parties is not there sufficiently enough to really create humanitarian corridors that will be more performing, more open, more safe for the population. Are you pointing at Moscow? We are pointing at no one. We try to negotiate in humanitarian diplomacy, quiet humanitarian diplomacy, with the parties to encourage those corridors and those evacuations, humanitarian evacuations, and to have the right to be respected. And you sometimes need keywords and clear words in our conversations, but as you know, the ICRC will remain an organization privileging a diplomatic and confidential dialogue more than strong statement in the public space. Peter Maurer, thank you for having accepted this interview on France 24 from Geneva, and thank you for watching it. Stay tuned for more news.
Pedir a los tres que cierren sus ojitos, a los tres por unos momentos, y van a imaginar cómo se visualizan ustedes de acá, digamos, o 1 año o 5 años. A ver, tú, Dylan, ¿cómo te has visualizado?
Me sentí como en Cusco, así, terminando mi tarea.
¡Ay, qué bonito! Que estabas en Cusco.
Sí, en Cusco, pero...
Usted, señora Jenny, ¿cómo se ha visualizado?
Bueno, en primer lugar, teniendo un trabajo fijo y después más adelante un negocio propio.
Un negocio propio. Muy bien. Entonces...
Focusing on the future to get over the grief. Dylan and his sister Graciela lost their father to COVID. Their mother, Jenny, was left without an income, and she is struggling to provide for the family. She receives help from the state-run National Family Welfare Program, or INABIF. Every 2 months, she's given €100 per child.
My husband passed 2 years ago, and it still hurts. This allowance enables me to take care of my children, at least for now. It means I don't have to worry about school tuition and groceries. We were left with nothing when he died, so it's a big help for us.
Beyond financial help, the INABIF provides children who lost a parent to COVID with psychological support.
The emotional aspect is even more important because we help them to use strategies and tools so that they're able to cope with the hardship.
In Peru, around 100,000 children have lost at least one of their 2 parents during the pandemic. It's more than anywhere else in the world. As of today, about 18,000 families in this difficult situation receive financial aid from the INABIF. In this family from the San Juan de Lurigancho district in Lima, the father died of COVID. His wife and children now find themselves in complete despair.
I lost my house, but at least there's always a solution for material things. But I lost my husband. I did everything I could to save him. I even went into debt, but he died. There were times when I thought I wouldn't be able to go on, but thank God my children are here. They give me the strength to keep going. Also, I get this stipend now, which is a precious help. What are you drawing? Go show us. Everything she does in school, she hangs on her dad's photo.
Peru was hit hard by the COVID-19 pandemic. For months, hospitals across the country couldn't treat all patients. With 212,000 deaths in a population of less than 33 million, the country has the highest COVID death rate worldwide. Today, even though the pandemic is slowing down, the impacts are still felt in Peru, and the INABIF is planning on supporting more orphans throughout the country.
We want to start by reaching 25,000 families, and then we aim to reach 90,000 in the next few years. We're working to register all orphans, something that's never been done before in Peru, and numbers are probably higher than we originally thought.
In Lima's poorest districts, the pandemic wreaked havoc. Many orphans and widows must go to soup kitchens every day or face going hungry. Over 3 million Peruvians fell into poverty since the pandemic started in March 2020. Despite the state giving financial help to many families, the future is filled with uncertainties for Peru's COVID orphans.
They observe. They contact us. They report, film, photograph. They are the voice of the voiceless. Your eyes in the far-flung reaches of the world. The Observers, a network of 5,000 committed citizens working with France 24.
One of our observers in Côte d'Ivoire, Gaspard.
Amateur footage and testimonials checked by our journalists and broadcast weekly on The Observers, on France 24 and observers.france24.com. On France 24, watch exclusive interviews with the world's most influential personalities.
We need to act together because we're protecting our freedom.
Encounters with key political leaders.
L'inquiétude, elle est extrême.
Leading figures from the worlds of culture, sport and science.
La science, la recherche, la découverte, le progrès, c'est important, c'est pas des mots qui sont vides.
Whatever you think is right, you can do.
Watch The Interview, a meeting of ideas on France 24 and France24.com. Liberté, égalité, actualité.
Hello and welcome. You're watching France 24. Coming up in Kyiv, the opening of the trial of a captured Russian soldier accused of killing an unarmed civilian. We'll cross live to correspondent Gulliver Cragg. Also in this edition, France 24 reports from Ukraine's bombed-out second city, Kharkiv. Clashes at the Jerusalem funeral of Al Jazeera correspondent Shireen Abu Akleh, with pallbearers at one point nearly dropping the casket. Meanwhile, an Israeli policeman killed in fresh violence in the West Bank town of Jenin, where she was killed on Wednesday. Correspondent Sami Sokol has the latest. North Korea confirms its first COVID death, admitting that cases were spreading explosively, with the population there unvaccinated, neighboring China and South Korea offering to help. In the next hour, the world this week. For China, a choice between health and wealth. Xi Jinping's government doubles down on its zero COVID policy while insisting it can maintain robust growth. We'll also be asking our Friday panel of journalists about the politics of the Eurovision Song Contest. Ukraine, the odds-on favorite to garner the sympathy vote in that annual ode to pop kitsch. Russia barred from this year's contest. Your thoughts on Facebook and Twitter. Hashtag World This Week. Hello, everyone. I'm François Picard. In Ukraine, there's the ground war and the information war. The claim out of Kyiv is the destruction of a pontoon in the east of the country that's partially taken out a column of Russian armored vehicles. This while the Ukrainians claim to have damaged a Russian supply vessel in the Black Sea. But despite saying that Ukraine's forces have pushed the Russians away from firing distance from Kharkiv, the country's second city, still getting shelled. At least 2 killed in one attack on Thursday. France 24's Nadia Masi reports on those hunkering down and trying to carry on in Kharkiv.
A haven in central Kharkiv. This restaurant is one of very few open in Ukraine's second city. The hubbub and the music drowning out the air raid sirens in the streets.
The bar is the only place where we can come to rest and see people. Now it's getting much easier. There are fewer shellings. People are starting to come back, and that's beautiful.
Outside, the reality of life in the city under regular Russian attack is soon clear. Buildings bombed out, and families queuing for food.
We're here because there is no money and no jobs. I used to work in a cafe before the war. Then something horrible happened. A bomb flew right over us.
There have been fewer bombardments in the city itself this past week as Ukrainian forces push Russian troops back. But the shelling from the suburbs is still audible here. And with over 1,600 apartment blocks destroyed, hundreds of families have been forced to live underground in the Soviet-built metro network.
A young family lives over there. Here, it's me and my husband, and over there, there's an old woman. It's cold and damp. I just want it to be over soon. It's hard to keep this metro carriage clean and to shower, but we do our best.
Many have been here since the early weeks of the war, when bombardments were particularly intense, trying to create a semblance of daily routine underground.
After weeks under heavy bombardment, there is no normal life yet for the residents of Kharkiv, but some are starting to look to the future. And in this Russian-speaking city, streets are being renamed. Moscow Avenue will become the Avenue of the Heroes of Kharkiv.
Nadia Masi. Over in Kyiv, the preliminary hearing for the first war crimes trial arising since the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. a captured Russian soldier charged with the murder of a 62-year-old civilian. Let's cross live to France 24 correspondent Gulliver Cragg. There was no plea submitted. This is uncharted legal territory.
Yes, this is the first time that there's been a war crimes trial in Ukraine. Ukraine hasn't created a special war crimes tribunal or anything. It's just happening in an ordinary criminal court. The suspect, though, was in the dock today. His name is Vadim Shisimarin, and he's 21 years old. He's a sergeant in the Russian army, now in Ukrainian captivity. This was a preliminary hearing to set the date for the first hearing proper, which will be next Wednesday, the 18th of May. But as it's such a historic event, it was absolutely packed with journalists. I mean, you could really not fit in there a huge amount of attention. And both the prosecution and the defense lawyer appointed by the Ukrainian state, had a lot to say about what was going on, about the evidence, its witnesses that basically saw what happened, that this Russian soldier apparently shot an unarmed civilian in a village in northern Ukraine. That's quite rare compared to some of the other places where war crimes in Ukraine have allegedly been committed, where there is a lack of witnesses, because people in Irpin and Bucha, well, first of all, so many of them had fled those areas, and then those who were around were mostly hiding in basements, partly to avoid falling victims to the Russians themselves.
He's considered a defendant, not a prisoner of war.
He's considered a criminal defendant. Yes, it's a criminal case. The defense lawyer explained that that is just the way that Ukrainian law works, that this will be a criminal trial. But as I said, he has been given a defense lawyer. It's not yet clear what his plea will be. Apparently, he has admitted to killing this man, but he has not yet pleaded guilty, in the sense that his plea may be, but this is speculation here, and the defense lawyer himself speculated on this, whilst making clear that the decision had not been made. He may plead that he was following orders and therefore had no choice to enact the orders of his superiors. The prosecution lawyers said that if that were to be the case, then that plea would have to be taken into account and might affect the sentencing, but it certainly didn't absolve the Russian soldier of all responsibility.
Was the case held in Russian or Ukrainian?
Oh, in Ukrainian, of course. Ukrainian is the only official language in Ukraine, and so the Russian defendant had a translator on hand to translate from Ukrainian for him.
How did he seem?
Young. I don't know what else to say about it, really. He didn't show any emotion on his face. I can't say that he looked... I really can't say that his face revealed any emotion at all. The most striking thing about him, of course, was that he's a very young man. He's only 21.
Gulliver Cragg, many thanks for that update from Kyiv. Russia says it's to cut electricity to neighboring Finland. This after the Nordic nation formally announced its intention to apply for NATO membership. Finnish authorities say they only get 10% of their electricity from Russia and should be able to weather the disruptions. Finland alongside Sweden, who early next week could make that application for NATO membership formal. However, there is blowback within the alliance. Turkey's president taking exception to Sweden's defense in the past of Kurdish militants.
Scandinavian countries are guest houses for terrorist organizations. Members of the PKK and the DHKPC are hiding in Sweden and the Netherlands. There are even members of parliament in some countries. At this point, it is not possible for us to take a positive view.
In Jerusalem, the funeral of slain Al Jazeera correspondent Shireen Abu Akleh. At times, it proved tense. At one point, Israeli police charging demonstrators, pallbearers, nearly dropping the coffin at one point. Selena Sykes has more.
Tensions run high in Jerusalem as Shireen Abu Akleh is laid to rest. Thousands of Palestinians gathered in the holy city to pay their respects to the journalist. Israeli forces were seen charging at the group carrying her coffin outside the hospital in East Jerusalem, where her body remained overnight. Friends and family attended a funeral service at a church packed with mourners before thousands marched in a procession to Mount Zion Protestant Cemetery, where the 51-year-old was buried alongside her parents. Abu Akleh's death has sparked outrage among Palestinians and condemnation from the international community. The veteran correspondent, who had long reported on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, was shot in the head on Wednesday while reporting on an Israeli raid in the West Bank for Al Jazeera. Video footage of the shooting shows she was wearing a helmet and a vest that clearly indicated that she was a member of the press. Israeli authorities say an initial investigation has failed to determine whether Abu Akleh was shot by Israeli forces or by Palestinian militants. Israel has proposed a joint investigation with Palestinian authorities into Abu Akleh's death, though Palestine has refused to hand over the bullets for examination. Anger over Abu Akleh's death is adding more fuel to an already tense situation in Jerusalem, just weeks after violent clashes at Al-Aqsa Mosque.
Well, for more, let's cross to Jerusalem and correspondent Sami Sokol. Sami, what more do we know about the circumstances of those clashes, those images we saw surrounding the funeral?
Yeah, well, the body of Shireen Abu Akleh was held in the French hospital in the area of Wadi Joz in East Jerusalem. And there was a group of Palestinians who said that they would like to take the body and instead of taking it in a car to the cemetery, rather carry it. Now, the police, they charged into the hospital. They were very aggressive. They decided at any cost to prevent this from happening, and we saw some very aggressive scenes in the entrance of the hospital with Israeli forces dispersing these Palestinians who gathered there. And I can tell you that there were tens of thousands who came for the funeral of Shireen Abu Akleh. But the Israeli police, they staged their forces in Damascus Gate, in Jaffa Gate, in the New Gate, and they were preventing people from joining. Those who succeeded in coming came to the Greek Orthodox cemetery here on the Mount of Zion right behind me. And we saw the participation of Palestinian members of Knesset. We saw both Muslims, Christians, even though the ceremony itself was Christian, and also there was a ceremony in the Catholic Church, even though she was a Greek Orthodox. There was an attempt to have like all dominations kind of represented. There was also a Muslim prayer on Friday. Today's Friday, so they had a afternoon prayer next to the church. So we had like a representative of all Palestinian society, and she is seen here amongst Palestinians as a symbol of Palestine and Palestinian nationalism, on top of the fact that she was a journalist and on top of the fact that she's an American citizen, which is the reason why we also saw American diplomats at the funeral here in Jerusalem.
And as far as the investigation goes, I know on Thursday, the Palestinian president rejected the idea of a joint inquiry with Israel. Where's that going to go?
Yeah, well, the Palestinian Authority, they announced through Hussein al-Sheikh, who is the minister in charge of relations with Israel, that they're not going to cooperate on this kind of investigation. They're saying that all the evidence indicates that Shireen Abu Akleh was shot and killed by Israeli soldiers. And so what we have now is the Israeli military, they have their own investigation. And according to their investigation, there was a special unit named the Duvdevan unit that was shooting in the area, and they were interrogating the soldiers there. None of the soldiers said that they shot at the journalists, but the IDF is today saying that it could have been a situation in which soldiers shot towards Palestinian militants and Shireen Abu Akleh and Ali Samoudi, the producer, were caught in crossfire. I must tell you that talking to Palestinians in the cemetery today, everyone is sure that Shireen was targeted. Some were saying that she was targeted because she was working for Al Jazeera, and this is the mood on the Palestinian Strait.
Sami Sokol reporting live from Jerusalem. Many thanks for that update. Chinese authorities insist that weeks of draconian lockdown measures are paying off and that COVID restrictions could be eased perhaps as early as next week in places like Shanghai. Local residents, though, don't see it that way. They are frustrated, particularly those who are testing as negative and then nonetheless forced to isolate. It's a France 24 report.
Shanghai has been at a standstill for 6 weeks, with more and more fences going up and police checkpoints in the street. No date for the end of the lockdown has been announced. Restrictions have been tightened. Inhabitants now fear being forcibly sent to isolation, even if they've tested negative.
We have to transfer you. You've been named as a contact case. Open up or we'll knock the door in.
Just one positive case in a building can result in all its occupants being sent to isolation centres, and there's no asking questions.
Don't ask me why. There's no why. Respect the national regulations for pandemic control. That's how it is.
Once the residents have been taken away, workers disinfect their entire homes. With toxic fumes sprayed into every corner, all food is thrown out. Meanwhile, hunger has pushed some to revolt.
Come on, everyone come down.
These residents are no longer receiving any provisions, and they have come to blows with their guards. The city's inhabitants are at their wits' end. But regardless of the anger and distress, the crackdown continues. This man being bound with tape was accused of violating regulations. The government continues to insist that the zero-COVID strategy is the only one viable for China. It's a doctrine preached by state TV.
Our policies can stand the test of history and are scientific and effective. Since we have won the battle in Wuhan, we will win the one in Shanghai.
In addition to Shanghai, more than 40 Chinese cities are under either complete or partial lockdown. Even the capital Beijing is on edge. It has been operating on slowdown on foot of fewer than 1,000 cases recorded in the past 3 weeks.
North Korea confirms its first death from COVID. Pyongyang saying that the fever was spreading explosively nationwide, with its 25 million citizens unvaccinated. Public health experts on the outside fear the country is a ticking time bomb. So do neighboring China and South Korea, have offered to help. Leo McGuinn has more.
Kim Jong-un visiting North Korea's National Epidemic Prevention Headquarters. Earlier on Thursday, according to state media, the country's leader had met with Worker Party members to discuss the COVID outbreak in the country. His response: to declare a gravest state of emergency and to announce a national lockdown. State media have said that 6 people have died and thousands have fell ill of fever, but they have acknowledged that one of the 6 to die was infected with the Omicron variant. According to the official news agency, 350,000 people have been treated for fever since late April. More than 180,000 North Koreans are currently in isolation and undergoing treatment, although it has not been specified how many of them tested positive for COVID-19. The nation's 26 million people are believed to be mostly unvaccinated. North Korea had rejected offers of vaccination from the WHO, but also from China and Russia. Experts say an outbreak could be a catastrophe.
Because of COVID, food shortages and the economic crisis might deteriorate in North Korea. In order to prevent that, North Korea is conducting food rationing measures. So they're under very severe quarantine measures to prevent a mass outbreak of confirmed COVID cases.
According to experts, the virus was imported into North Korea by a person who crossed the border illegally from China.
Well, for more, let's go to Preston in England. Seo-Jin Lim is Associate Professor in Korean Studies at the University of Central Lancashire. Thank you for being with us here on France 24.
Thank you for inviting me today.
You know, we were listening to the end of that report where they were speculating over whether or not the COVID came in at a military parade at the end of last month, and that's how it spread. It always begs the question, before we go into the heart of the matter, of how much do we know about what is going on in North Korea?
That is the most fascinating part when we talk about North Korea, how much we know. As a matter of fact, as we can all easily imagine, for now currently, there's nothing much we can confirm for sure, because not only because of the border closure began from January 2020, also because diplomats or aid workers or other foreigners in North Korea, including university lecturers, all are now moved out of the country. So basically, up until recently, the only possible way to communicate and to confirm what is the situation in North Korea really was through the mobile phones, because some residents could use mobile phones and then speak with outside, even though it was under the surveillance system. Secretly, they could have. But recently, those surveillance system became stronger, and also the internal lockdown and then the mobility within the country was really restricted. So because of that, we can't confirm that what is exactly going on, but what we can confirm is that now is officially that North Korea is not free from COVID-19 at all either.
COVID's been around for more than 2 years. Is it really possible that it only has entered North Korea now?
There can be two ways we can think of. At one way, we can think that it is possible because the border was closed, and even the illegal trade with China, which was prevalent before, was all closed and stopped. And if we see the number of North Korean defectors coming out of the country was all stopped. So in theory, it's possible because the country was isolated entirely. But at the same time, if there was any case around, but because North Korea did not have test facility for entire population, and also North Koreans didn't have a good medical facility at all anyway. And as we all now know that the North Koreans are not vaccinated. So it's also possible that there were some kind of cases which did not appear, but now it looks like the cases became uncontrollable.
So now it's a race against time to figure out how to be able to test people, how to be able to inoculate people. Looking at what the mindset is right now in Pyongyang, is it plausible, possible, probable that they will ask China for help?
So up until today, North Korea didn't ask any help. And even when COVAX, the WHO, tried to provide vaccines, North Korea denied and rejected the paperwork. And recently, COVAX now scrapped out their plan, the allocation of vaccines, but not from the China, but from South Korea, as we heard from previous interview that they have tried to provide vaccines. And today it was announced in Korea that the Korean government has more than enough vaccines at the moment, which can be provided to North Korea. So if we consider that, North Korea doesn't directly ask for help officially, but there's a way that if other countries approach North Korea, then they now would agree to open the door and then bring in the vaccines.
And what about South Korea? South Korea, which this Wednesday got a new conservative president.
So the new conservative president is very more like against the nuclear program, and then it was clear that he wants to see denuclearization first. But in terms of the humanitarian aid, it's more altruistic way, and there's no way the South Korean president be strong and then deny to provide the vaccines, because already many of NGOs in South Korea began to appeal the government that we need to provide vaccines to North Korea. And it's more will be a matter of whether North Korean government will accept these supplies from outside or not.
You know, we said we were talking at the outset, Seo-Jin Lim, about how we're reduced to reading tea leaves when it comes to North Korea. We've seen a lot of aggressive missile tests, pardon me, over the last couple of weeks and months. Is there a COVID factor to all of this?
It's quite tricky to say, because from my point of view personally, I see that the situation, the missile test recently, North Korean government did not mention what it was about and then what kind of missiles they tested. And it looked like, if we see the timing of the announcement about the COVID-19, it was more like a signal, like, in the past, they used nuclear test or the missile test for food aid. So this could be in the same similar context, saying that, signaling outside that the situation is like this, and then we are testing, and then if you want to stop us, then they maybe provide us the humanitarian aid. Kind of a message could be there. So that's how I see the situation.
Sojin Lim of the University of Central Lancashire, many thanks for speaking with us here on France 24.
Thank you.
In other news we're following for you, still no let-up in the defiance towards Sri Lanka's the president, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who on Thursday appointed a new prime minister.
The first full day of work for new Sri Lankan Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe. At a time when Sri Lanka's economy is in ruins, the appointment is doing little to appease the growing unrest.
He's here to save this government. He's promising that we will have all 3 meals daily. He's a big liar. We have already been fooled before. We will not get fooled again. We have very good university students. Hand over the government to them. They'll do a good job.
We will stop the struggle when our people get justice. Whoever they appoint as prime minister, we will not stop our struggle until people get relief.
The first challenge for the veteran politician is uniting a fractured government. The 73-year-old insists that he has enough support to govern, having approached several potential allies to join his administration. But one of his offers has already been publicly rejected. Opposition lawmaker Harsha De Silva turned down the chance to take charge of the nation's finances, saying he was instead siding with demonstrators. Since March, Sri Lankans have been protesting in the streets. On Monday, the situation turned violent, with several demonstrators killed and hundreds injured in clashes. Protesters continue to demand the resignation of President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who they say is to blame for the country's lengthy blackouts, shortages of food and fuel, and inflation rising to record levels.
More news coming up, plus the day's business and sports. Stay with us. You're watching France 24.
Years ago, the images of the fire that engulfed the medieval church of Notre Dame in Paris made headlines around the world. After the initial shock, thousands of men and women, including architects, scientists, or painters, started working around the clock to restore the building to its former glory. Notre Dame Revisited on France 24 and France24.com.
Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith.
All the latest in politics, economics and the arts in Africa on France 24. Our journalists are in every region, every country, to report on the emergence of a continent of unparalleled riches. Bringing you Africa's stories on France 24.
Thanks for joining us. See you again. Take care.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.
Welcome back. You're watching France 24. Coming up in Kyiv, the opening of the trial of a captured Russian soldier accused of killing an unarmed civilian. As Mali's junta calls for more anti-French demonstrations, fresh allegations of atrocities enabled or committed by the Russian mercenaries of Wagner. Shares on Twitter down nearly 7% after Elon Musk temporarily pauses his $44 billion bid for the social media giant. The billionaire denies getting cold feet, saying instead he wants more information about fake accounts. Cole Stengler will have all the day's business news. In Ukraine, there's the ground war and the information war. The claim out of Kyiv is the destruction of a pontoon in the east of the country that's partially taken out a column of Russian armored vehicles. This while the Ukrainians claim to have damaged a Russian supply vessel in the Black Sea. Now, that's happening, but there's still shelling going on in other parts with little incremental gains by the Russians. Meanwhile, over in the capital, a first for Ukraine, a war crimes trial. A 21-year-old Russian soldier standing accused of murdering an unarmed civilian who was riding a bicycle back in March.
He's the first Russian soldier to stand trial for committing a war crime. 21-year-old Vadim Shisimarin is accused of murdering an unarmed Ukrainian civilian while he was riding a bicycle. According to prosecutors, the Russian sergeant shot the 62-year-old man in the head through an open car window. The incident took place in the northeastern village of Chaipakiivka in the Sumy region just after the start of the war. Shisimarin's attorney said the case against his client is strong and that he hadn't yet decided how he'll plead.
He surrendered on his own. All other issues are related to material and criminal proceedings. All of this will be in subsequent hearings. He will give all the answers to all these questions when he testifies or not.
If convicted, he faces up to life in prison. The case is extremely important for Kyiv, as authorities press to hold Russia accountable for what they describe as unimaginable atrocities carried out by Russian forces. Ukrainian prosecutors say they're investigating over 10,000 possible war crimes involving over 600 suspects. The Kremlin continues to deny targeting civilians and has accused Kyiv of staging attacks as part of efforts to smear Russian troops.
Meanwhile, the last pocket of resistance in the Azov Sea port of Mariupol still has not fallen. Resistance continuing against the bombardment of the Azovstal steel mill compound. Jean-Emile Jamin has that story.
Explosions and fire in the heart of the Azovstal hell. These are images filmed by fighters of the Azov Battalion, the last pocket of resistance against the Russian offensive in Mariupol. Despite being completely outnumbered, they continue to hold out here in one of the largest steel plants in Europe. For now, the soldiers owe their survival to the gigantic network of underground tunnels where they've sheltered for several weeks. Even today, they refuse to give up their arms.
Every day may be our last day, so we probably might be talking last time right now, but who cares? Nobody cares. We do not care. No, we only care about the country. We care about our nation. And that's why we're trying to resolve it in the best way.
They're soldiers ready to give up their lives in the name of honor, but they also fear being captured and falling into the hands of the Russians. The Azov Battalion has become the direct target of propaganda driven by Moscow because of its creation by far-right Ukrainian soldiers in 2014. Now their relatives are appealing for any help that could rescue them.
My son is in hell in Azovstal. As I speak, they are fighting. What's happening there is not war. It's a massacre. It's a violation of all international conventions. It's a massacre of people who are all surrounded.
According to Red Cross officials present in Mariupol, as well as the Azov soldiers, at least 150,000 people have been unable to leave the besieged port city.
Mali's junta doubling down. There was a call to rally in the capital this Friday to support the military, say yes to withdrawing pure and simple from the G5 Sahel grouping with neighboring states and France in the fight against insurgent radical groups, and also no to renewing the mandate of MINUSMA. That's the UN mission. Well, for more, we're joined by Douglas Herbert from our International Affairs Desk. So Mali's junta first took on France, took on neighboring West African states over its decision to delay elections, and now taking on the United Nations.
Taking on the UN as well. Look, this mission, MINUSMA, as you call it, an awkward acronym, has basically, been on the ground as a peacekeeping mission officially for nearly a decade now. And obviously, the initial mission there was to help drive back Islamist jihadists that were threatening to encroach on and take over, seize the capital, Bamako. What we are seeing now is, an abrupt turn in both public opinion and in the government's attitude towards these European armies taking part in this UN mission here. The peacekeeping mission has been under review by the UN itself, but like you said, they're no longer really welcome in the country by Mali, and this is where the friction begins, because up until a couple of months ago, the Germans looked like they were intent on following the French and turning heel and pulling out. The French, as you know, earlier this year, they've been pulling out and drawing down their forces, removing them entirely from Mali. Germany basically saying, we're going to leave too, but they needed French, in the absence of the French reinforcements there, they couldn't do much. But now they're having second thoughts, and they want to, and they're yet to vote on it in Germany, but they want to perhaps extend that mission and even reinforce it up from about 1,000 soldiers to about 1,400. So it would be a substantial increase in the number of Germans there, coming at a time, like you said, where public opinion is very much against the continued presence of any European army, German army, German soldiers included, even in the framework of what is a multinational, international peacekeeping mission.
Mali, a former French colony, which has broken with Paris in the last month, spectacularly so. Latest example being a lawsuit filed against the French foreign minister.
That's right.
Instead, turning towards Russia. And on that score, there's fresh evidence that the mercenaries of Wagner going in with a heavy hand.
Let's step back here and let's just make sure we have all our terms correct, because yes, Russian mercenaries, Russian fighters, according to the French investigative publication Mediapart, they've gotten a lot of testimonies, both from locally elected officials, from eyewitnesses on the ground, from people who've been on the receiving ends of these alleged abuses, that there are indeed the so-called white instructors, as they're called by the people who give the testimony, but they are military instructors, i.e., according to Mediapart, part of the Wagner group. These are Russian mercenaries. Russia denies any official connection to them, saying they're a private mercenary, they're a private military group. They have nothing to do with the government. Fact is, one of Putin's closest inner circle friends is at the head of the Wagner group. So its plausible denial is not that plausible. What Mediapart has basically found through all of these different testimonies is that the Wagner group is up to, on the ground in Mali, the same types of things it was accused of when it was in Syria, when it was in Libya, when it was in the Central African Republic, and that is widespread abuses in cahoots with whatever army it is collaborating with on the ground. In this case, the Malian army, going into towns. They were accused by Human Rights Watch a little over a month ago of basically executing about 300 civilian men in a central town in Mali. And this is part of a broader pattern. And Mediapart, the testimony that they have recovered, sort of speaks to and validates, if you will, this broader pattern. Like I said, Wagner Group does not, they do not obviously address this issue at all. The Mali government doesn't admit that the Wagner Group is even there. They do acknowledge there are military instructors on the ground in Mali. They don't say the Wagner Group is helping our forces to fight jihadists or do anything else there. So a little murky, but Mediapart has been extremely diligent in its investigation. It has a lot of very damning evidence against this group, which is coming in, I will note, to Mali at a time when, like you said, the Western Europeans are all pulling out. Russia stepping into the breach there, and I'll just leave you with this thought. It's not just about helping beat back jihadism and fight terror. There's a lot of gold, there's a lot of diamonds, there's a lot of aluminum mines there in Mali. So not just the Russians, but the Westerners too have been accused of having their eyes more on that than anything else.
Douglas Herbert, many thanks for that update. In neighboring Burkina Faso, families are still holding out hope of getting miners up from a shaft that collapsed nearly 1 month ago in a zinc mine. Jean-Emile Jamin has that story.
A desperate rescue effort, but with little success so far. Nearly 30 days after a flood trapped 8 workers in a Burkina Faso zinc mine, there's been no news of their situation. Mathieu Patino, a survivor miner, was 400 meters underground on that day, thinking it would be his last.
It's a day I will never forget until I die.
That day, Mathieu was driving a 700-ton excavator that was swept away by the water current.
I saw everything. I couldn't get out. I had to go through the emergency exit.
The Canadian group that operates the mine has been accused of delaying action.
We are facing a completely unpredictable situation. The amount of water that came in was much higher than the pumps we had.
Now, every day, the families of the missing miners gather in support and pray together. One of those present, Sylvie Bama, sells used clothing, but counts on her husband's income to support their 4 children.
We have hope. We know they will come back. We're really counting on God for them to come back, for my husband to come back. We pray.
Mélène Bazier, who is 8 months pregnant, fears for her child's future without her husband by her side.
I have been sitting here for 26 days, every day from morning to night. We're devastated. Nobody gives us concrete answers. Every day we hope for good news, and that's why we come here every morning.
It is possible that the men reached a rescue chamber in the mine, stocked with food and water. But Burkina Faso's Labour Ministry says water samples have to be studied first for safety reasons before rescuers can go underwater to reach the chamber.
Colombia has become South America's first nation to allow assisted medical suicide for seriously ill patients. This would be under a doctor's supervision. Is following a decision by the country's constitutional court. Selena Sykes has the story.
A historic decision and a first for Latin America. Colombia's constitutional court has approved medically assisted suicide for those suffering from serious or incurable illnesses.
Advances in science must be used in a selfless and solidary way for those who are seriously ill and want to die with dignity.
Colombia is the first country in Latin America to take such a step, and one of just a few in the world. Euthanasia was legalized in 1997. Now, a seriously ill patient can take their own life with a lethal drug under the supervision of a doctor.
Assisted suicide is not going to be a crime if the act is performed by a doctor, so just like euthanasia, it remains an exclusively medical act.
The ruling, backed by 6 out of 9 judges, has received mixed reaction in the Roman Catholic country where religion has a big influence.
It's progress, and it above all sends a message to society that people have a right to choose at a given moment how and when they should die.
I think in this case, we belong to a divine creation of God. He decides the moment we're born, and he also decides when we die.
According to government figures, fewer than 200 people have opted for euthanasia since 1997.
Time now for business. We say hello to Cole Stangler.
Hey, Francois.
We are focused once again. He's managed to grab our attention. Elon Musk and his on or off bid for Twitter.
Yeah, it's the latest twist here in this ongoing saga, and it comes, of course, in the form of a tweet from Elon Musk himself. He said the $44 billion deal now, quote, temporarily on hold. Here you can see that tweet. Musk saying he's waiting for details on the share of fake accounts on the platform, also sharing a story on the topic that shows Twitter estimates those fake accounts make up less than 5% of daily users. Now, this number does matter because the amount of monetizable users, of course, a big part of the company's value, though some analysts are wondering just why this issue is being raised right now. Is it perhaps a bargaining strategy? Is it perhaps even a way to try to maybe walk away from this deal? Musk, for his part, says he's still committed to the deal, though Twitter shareholders, we're going to see in a moment here, not taking too kindly to this latest development. Its shares down 7.8% today. So clearly, regardless of Musk's underlining his commitment to this, clearly some degree of anxiety here about Twitter.
Yeah, some degree of anxiety. That's an understated way of putting it. And there's volatility as well in the cryptocurrency market.
Yeah, it's been a rough couple of days across the board, triggered by the collapse of Terra USD. Now, this is a so-called algorithmic stablecoin, meaning it was supposed to be pegged to the dollar, but that's not what happened. That's not what it did. Under pressures from the markets, traders, it really just kept falling. That, in turn, spooked investors across the crypto world. And Terra has now been delisted from major exchanges. And you can see now almost worth literally nothing, almost, around 10 cents. Some have likened this to an old-fashioned bank run, really. You have another so-called stable coin that people are closely keeping an eye on. And you can also see Bitcoin, of course. Bitcoin is paring back some of its heavy losses earlier this week, though all in all here, the storyline is crypto, not exactly a beacon of stability, another understatement for you, Francois, and clearly not immune to the broader market anxiety that we've been seeing here on Wall Street and in the European markets. Let's take a look now at the actual stock markets here with Wall Street posting some gains to close out an otherwise pretty rough week. The Nasdaq up 4%, gains on the Dow Jones about 1.5% there. Well, next up, G7 finance ministers are preparing more financial aid for Ukraine. Germany's Spiegel magazine reporting they'll provide close to 30 billion euros, a mix of loans and grants to be hammered out when they meet next week. In the meantime, G7 foreign ministers are in talks until Saturday. They were joined today by their counterpoint from Ukraine. He had some pointed words for EU leaders in particular, urging them to include an oil embargo in the latest wave of sanctions against Russia. Take a listen.
If this package is adopted without oil embargo, I believe President Putin can celebrate, because it will be the first case when the unity of the European Union will be broken because of the position of one country, Hungary.
And finally, as voters in Lebanon prepare to head to the polls this weekend, the country's devastating economic crisis remains a top concern. Whichever coalition comes out on top, they'll face the difficult task of obtaining a critical bailout from the IMF. Olivia Bizot reports.
It's been called one of the world's worst financial crises. 2 years ago, Lebanon defaulted on its debt, and the Lebanese pound has since lost more than 90% of its value. That means people's savings and salaries have tanked, and more than 80% of the population now live in poverty.
We used to be able to buy things, even though there were difficulties. We couldn't buy everything. But now, with the crisis affecting us more, we can only buy food and water. We can't buy anything else.
The Lebanese parliament voted in on Sunday has a lot of work to do. Priority number one is to finalise a bailout from the IMF. While the group's given its conditional approval to a $3 billion loan package, the new government will have to commit to reforms to access that cash.
Our negotiations with the IMF are not only about finance, but also reforming issues, because it is a signal to the donor countries to start to work with Lebanon and to put Lebanon back on the financial international map.
Some of the reforms include changes in bank secrecy laws to tackle financial crimes and restructuring Lebanon's banks.
Francois, just one more number to give you here that illustrates the depth of that crisis in Lebanon. The unemployment rate has tripled since 2019, so clearly a very difficult situation there.
A difficult situation there ahead of Sunday's elections. Many thanks, Cole Stangler, who will be back with more business news, including the closing word on Wall Street later. It's time now to go to Lisbon. France 24's culture team is taking a look at how African music is breaking down cultural barriers in that country.
This Portuguese singer's family come from one of Portugal's former colonies. A champion of Lisbon's new wave of Afro-electronic sounds, he sings of a new Lisbon, a city recognizing and accepting its diverse social fabric.
Hello, family. My name is Dino de Santiago. I'm an artist with Cape Verdean origins. Lisbon is my base, and is the base where I really found my voice, found my mission, mixing traditional sound with electronic and global sounds.
What is the new Lisbon?
The new Lisbon, it's an idea. This melting pot that I call cachupa, that is a typical food from Cape Verde, that is a food where you combine everything and you mix. That's my new Lisbon. My new Lisbon is a new Lisbon where black and white will have the same opportunities. So it's kind of a utopia. I'm like projecting the future and really doing songs and doing music for this new generation. So that's when I sing the new Lisbon, it's like a prophecy.
Dino, tell us a bit about your origins. Where do you come from? Where does your family come from?
Okay. My family come from Cape Verde, the island of Santiago. That's why I'm Dino de Santiago. And I was born and raised in the south of Portugal, Quarteira. My family is very, very Catholic, and music was my God. You know, and in music, I found my space to speak with God and to speak the message that I want to spread. I felt really the connection between me and who's listening to me. And now I feel that I'm really 100% Cape Verdean and 100% Portuguese. I don't need to choose one side.
So how does Lisbon influence your sound and your music?
First, because it's the city that have more African heritage. 16th century, you had like black communities and black elite, and from the other side, you had a big story with slavery. And Lisbon is like one of the epicenters of like that terrible moment in history. And most of the Europe don't know that Portugal is responsible for half of the slave people that came out from this side of the Atlantic to the other side. Because of that forced exodus of black people here, you have a culture that is very African, Afro-European, that now I'm translating in music.
With 5 acclaimed albums, Dino's music addresses Portugal's ugly colonial history. Through lyrics, but also through the symbolic bringing together the traditional African rhythms Morna, Batuca and Funana with electronic music. And he has a massive following. Dino has won numerous awards at the Portuguese Grammys, including Best Local Artist. He's the face of national radio station, Vodafone FM.
Música portuguesa ouve-se aqui na Vodafone FM. Dino, Santiago e Branco, mais uma vez, juntos em loucura. Dino's music is very, very important because it touches the wound, you know? He brings a strong message, like a hope message. He informs, he educates people as well with his songs. So describe your sound and your music.
I really went to Cape Verde and to understand the pattern of each rhythm and the richness that we have in Cape Verde. The rhythms that I explore more is like Funana and Batuco, and now I take Funana and Batuco to the clubs around Europe or to America. We have like 6 countries in Africa that speak Portuguese, but they have rhythms, wow. So I will explore those rhythms and give my twist and put this pop energy on it.
Coming up, more news, and then it's The World This Week. We'll be asking our Friday panel of journalists about China doubling down with a zero-COVID policy that threatens the world economy to a degree, what with major cities like Shanghai, home to so many factories that matter to Western corporate giants. Your thoughts, your reactions on Facebook and Twitter #WorldThisWeek.
With one of the world's highest population densities, Rwanda is experiencing a demographic explosion.
cy'umuhindo cyageze ku mvura nyinshi mu kwezi kwa kane no kwa 12 ndimuka nkagenda none ubu dore muri iyi minsi imvura iri kugwa cyane none ndazinze ndagiye.
Overpopulated and poorly built cities, excessive farming and erosion, saturated job markets are all part of Rwanda's current and future challenges. Fortunately, projects are underway, bringing hope.
This is the village of the future. It's green. We are planning to have water collection, rainwater harvesting, which is, of course, one of the green village pillar.
Don't miss Reporters on France 24 and France24.com.
France 24, every art form.
Liberté, égalité, actualité. France 24, your economy explained. Liberté, égalité, actualité.